A millionaire paid a homeless woman to have a baby, but when the child was born, what he saw left him stunned. Welcome back, everyone. Today's story is one that's sure to inspire and touch your heart. It's a tale of transformation, love, and finding hope in unexpected places. So, grab a cup of tea, get comfortable, and let's dive into this incredible journey together. Jimmy Lewis was 42 years old and seemed to have it all: money, power, and status. But as he looked around at his luxurious lifestyle, he realized something was missing: an heir. Jimmy wanted a child, but he didn't want a traditional family. He had already been through 2 marriages that both ended in disappointment. Love, he thought, was a distraction, a source of trouble. A child, on the other hand, was different, a legacy, a continuation of all he had built. He decided not to seek another relationship. Instead, he wanted a clear arrangement, a business deal with no emotional strings attached. With his wealth, he knew he could find someone willing to carry the child without questions or emotional involvement. For Jimmy, this was a straightforward transaction, just like any other. He would remain in control, and the arrangement would be on his terms. He just needed to find someone willing to accept his proposition. The next morning, as Jimmy drove his sleek sports car through the city, his mind was preoccupied with his plan. He scanned his surroundings for someone who might fit the role. Stopped at a red light downtown, his gaze fell on a young woman sitting on the sidewalk. She was hunched over, drawing on a piece of dirty paper. Her brown hair was tangled and her clothes were worn, but her blue eyes shone with an intensity that caught Jimmy's attention. To everyone else, she was invisible, but he couldn't look away. The light turned green and Jimmy accelerated. But a few blocks later, he couldn't shake the image of the woman. He pulled into a parking lot and stared at the steering wheel, wrestling with his thoughts. "This is absurd," he muttered, but something told him to turn back. Giving in to the impulse, he drove back to where he had seen her. She was still there, now propping her paper against a wall. He parked, rolled down his window, and spoke in a direct, no-nonsense tone. "Hey, you, come here." The young woman glanced at him suspiciously, her eyes narrowing as she sized up the sharply dressed man in the expensive car. She hesitated. "I'm not asking," Jimmy said curtly. "Come on, I don't have all day." Reluctantly, she approached. Up close, her thin frame and worn appearance were even more apparent. Despite this, there was a quiet strength in her posture. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Jimmy studied her briefly. "Get in. I'll take you somewhere we can talk." She laughed dryly. "I'm not one of those women, if that's what you're thinking." He frowned, clearly irritated. "Don't be ridiculous. I don't have time for that. I just need to talk. Get in or keep living on that sidewalk." Her hesitation lingered, but something in his commanding tone made it hard to refuse. Finally, she opened the car door and climbed in. They rode in silence. Jimmy didn't seem bothered by it. He drove to a quiet cafe far from the city's bustle and parked. "What's your name?" he asked, once they were seated at a table in the corner. "Sarah Parker. But why does that matter?" she retorted, her tone still wary. "Because I need to know who I'm dealing with. Tell me, Sarah, why do you sit on the sidewalk drawing as if nothing else matters?" She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "What else is there to do? I have nowhere to go. I lost everything, but that's none of your business." Jimmy leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "All right, I'll get straight to the point. I want to make you an offer, something that could change your life." Her eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I want you to have a child for me." Sarah stared at him as though she hadn't heard right. "You're joking, right? I'm completely serious. I'll cover all your expenses, provide full support during the pregnancy, and at the end, you'll receive enough money to never worry about finances again." She laughed nervously, folding her arms. This has to be a joke. What kind of man offers that to a complete stranger? The kind of man who knows exactly what he wants and doesn't waste time. "I'm not looking for a relationship. Sarah, I'm not looking for drama, just a child. Nothing more." Sarah stared at Jimmy in disbelief. His request repeated in her head, "I want you to have my child." She wanted to dismiss it outright, to call him crazy, but his unwavering expression made it clear he was serious. His cold, logical words struck her hard, leaving her torn between her pride and the grim reality of her situation. "This is insane," Sarah finally said. "No sane woman would agree to something like this." Jimmy's expression remained firm, his calculated demeanor unfaltering. "No woman in your position would turn it down," he replied. "I'm offering you a way out, comfort, stability, and a fresh start in exchange for something you already possess, the ability to have a child." Sarah folded her arms, attempting to maintain a facade of defiance. Yet deep down, she recognized the truth in his words. Her life was a constant fight just to survive. Even so, the idea of selling something so personal, even for financial security, made her stomach twist. "And then what?" she asked, her voice skeptical. "What happens after the baby is born?" Jimmy leaned back slightly, as though he had been waiting for the question. "When the child is born, you'll receive enough money to start over. No conditions, no strings. You'll be free to do whatever you wish." She laughed dryly. "No strings? And how do I know you won't change your mind and drag me into court later?" He studied her carefully before replying. "Sarah, I'm a businessman. I don't enter into agreements without making sure everyone benefits. This would be a legally binding contract. Neither of us could alter the terms afterward." She fell silent, taking in his words. The promise of security, however temporary, was alluring. She had nothing, not even a place to sleep that night. But she knew that agreeing to this would be a life-changing decision. "And what if I say no?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. Jimmy's lips curved into a faint smile. "Then you go back to the streets. You keep struggling, battling the cold and hunger. The choice is yours." His blunt words hit her like a punch. She wanted to despise him for his directness, but what stung more was the truth behind them. He had cornered her, and she knew it. But there was one more thing she needed to understand. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded. "A man like you, with all your money, why not adopt a child or find one of those wealthy women who flaunt their perfect kids?" Jimmy exhaled deeply before answering, his tone more serious than before. "Because I want something that's mine, an heir of my own blood. Adopting or dealing with someone in my social circle creates complications I don't want. I want control, Sarah. Nothing more, nothing less." The icy certainty in his words made her look away, uneasy. She knew he was being honest, and that honesty left her feeling exposed. "I need time to think," she said at last, trying to regain a sense of control. Jimmy nodded, as if he'd anticipated her answer. "You have 24 hours. After that, don't bother contacting me." He stood, turned toward the door, and left without another word. As he disappeared, Sarah felt as though she were being drawn into a storm from which there might be no escape. She wandered the streets, Jimmy's words replaying in her mind. Comfort, stability, a new life. She knew what it meant to have nothing. The bitter cold, the endless hunger, the constant fear. All those struggles would still be waiting for her tomorrow. She sat on a park bench, staring at the overcast sky. Her mother had always said, "Opportunities only knock once, and it's up to you to decide whether to seize them or let them slip away." But at what price? Having a child, even as part of a contract, was no small matter. But if this was her one chance to escape her misery, could she afford not to take it? Meanwhile, Jimmy was at home, reviewing the contract his lawyers had carefully prepared. He despised waiting, but he also knew that Sarah had few options. If she refused, he'd move on. Simple as that. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. His receptionist's voice informed him that Sarah had arrived. "Send her up," he replied, his tone neutral. A few moments later, the door opened, and Sarah stepped inside. Her eyes were tired, but resolved. "I accept," she said plainly. Jimmy stood and scrutinized her expression. There was no sign of hesitation, only determination. "Good. Let's make it official." He gestured for her to sit as he retrieved the contract. Sarah examined the document carefully. The terms were clear. She would be fully provided for during her pregnancy, with all expenses covered. At the end, she would receive a large sum to rebuild her life. In return, she would relinquish all parental rights to the child. "This feels so final," Sarah murmured as she read. "Exactly what I want," Jimmy replied. "I hope it's what you want, too." Sarah hesitated, taking a deep breath, then picked up the pen. With a quick motion, she signed her name, sealing an agreement that would forever change their lives. The signing of the contract marked a shift in Sarah Parker's life. That same day, Stephanie, Jimmy's assistant, escorted her to a black car waiting outside. As Sarah looked out the window, the city she once found overwhelming now seemed to offer something different, a chance to start over. During the ride to Jimmy's mansion, Sarah didn't say much, though Stephanie tried to fill the silence. "You'll like the place," Stephanie offered in a friendly tone. "It's quiet, spacious, and, most importantly, comfortable." Sarah only nodded, still absorbing the events of the past few hours. When the car arrived, Sarah's eyes widened. The monumental iron gate opened to reveal a property surrounded by immaculately maintained gardens. At the center stood the mansion, an imposing structure of marble and glass, as cold and calculated as the man who owned it. Inside, the extravagant details made Sarah uneasy. Crystal chandeliers, sweeping marble staircases, and furniture that seemed straight out of a design magazine. This was not her world, but for now, it was her new reality. "I'll show you to your room," Stephanie said with a smile. "It's one of the best suites in the house." Following in silence, Sarah entered a room dominated by a large bed with linen sheets, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a bathroom larger than any apartment she'd ever lived in. "If you need anything, just call me. We're here to take care of you," Stephanie said before leaving. Alone, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the soft sheets. It felt strange. Only yesterday, she had been sleeping on cold sidewalks. Now she was surrounded by luxury. Yet, despite the comfort, she felt a heavy weight in the air. She wasn't a guest. She was part of a business deal. In the following days, Sarah adjusted to a new routine. Meals arrived promptly, and a team of doctors conducted initial exams. Jimmy remained distant, absorbed in work, and rarely appearing at the mansion. When they did cross paths, it was brief and businesslike. Once, after a medical appointment, Sarah encountered Jimmy in the hallway. His posture was impeccable, his expression serious. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone neutral, as though asking out of duty rather than concern. Sarah hesitated before answering. "Everything is as expected, I guess." He nodded, not pressing further, but before walking away, he added, "If you need anything, ask Stephanie. I want you to be well." Sarah wasn't sure what to make of his comment. Was it genuine concern or just an attempt to keep the arrangement on track? Either way, the moment lingered in her mind. Although she was being treated like royalty, Sarah struggled with inner turmoil. Late one night, she walked onto her room's balcony and looked out at the moonlit garden. It was peaceful, so different from her previous life. Hugging herself against the cool breeze, she wondered, am I doing the right thing? The thought of carrying a child only to give it away grew more complex. The contract was clear. She would have no claim to the baby, but she couldn't predict how she would feel when the time came. Jimmy, meanwhile, kept a distant watch. He knew Sarah was resilient, but could see that she carried emotional weight. Despite his typically cold demeanor, he felt a faint curiosity. Who was this woman who had accepted such an unusual offer? And why couldn't he entirely dismiss the idea that she might be more than just a part of his plan? One evening, Sarah sat in the living room, idly flipping through a book from the mansion's shelves. She wasn't particularly interested in the classics, but the quiet house and the scent of old books offered a sense of calm. Then Jimmy walked in, unexpectedly, holding a folder of documents. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, stopping in the middle of the room. "I didn't expect you to talk to me," she replied with a sarcastic smile. He frowned, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed the folder on the table and sat down in an armchair. "Are you settling in?" he asked, crossing his arms. "I think so," she answered hesitantly, "but it still feels strange. It doesn't feel real." Jimmy leaned forward slightly. "It doesn't have to feel strange. This is a contract, Sarah, an agreement. I assure you, everything will go exactly as planned." "That's what you do, isn't it?" she said, a hint of defiance in her voice. "Plan everything, calculate everything, leave no room for mistakes." He studied her carefully, as if weighing whether the conversation was worth continuing. "That's how I've built everything I have. Planning prevents failure," he finally replied. Sarah gave a short laugh, shaking her head. "Sometimes failure is inevitable. You can plan everything, but you can't control how you feel, Jimmy." Her words struck him like a blow. He leaned back in his chair without answering. Sarah noticed his reaction, but didn't press further. She simply picked up the book she had set aside and left the room, leaving Jimmy alone, deep in thought. The days passed, and Sarah began adjusting to life in Jimmy's mansion. The environment was luxurious, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. Every expensive piece of furniture and decoration seemed to emphasize that this wasn't her place. Still, she followed the routine, regular medical appointments and meals prepared by chefs. But despite the comfort, she couldn't escape a lingering emotional emptiness. At night, alone in her room, she would think about what she had left behind. Though it wasn't much, it was the only life she had known. Now, everything felt out of her control. Carrying a child and then giving it away, it was a thought that haunted her, especially in the quiet hours of the night. While Sarah dealt with her inner conflicts, Jimmy kept his distance, watching her from afar. On the surface, he maintained his reserved demeanor, but he couldn't help feeling a growing curiosity about her. Even in the middle of his meetings and work commitments, his thoughts would drift to Sarah. It wasn't romantic or emotional, at least not yet, just a curiosity he couldn't fully explain. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, Jimmy returned home to find Sarah sitting on a bench in the garden, her face tilted toward the sky. The scene contrasted sharply with the tough image he had of her. For a moment, he hesitated to approach, then walked over. "Enjoying the garden?" he asked, his tone firm and direct. Sarah turned slightly, surprised by his approach, but quickly responded, "It's nice. Definitely better than the streets." He sat beside her, leaving some distance between them. Something about Sarah's honesty was disarming. "Are you settling in?" he asked. Sarah shrugged, her gaze on the flowers in front of her. "It still feels strange, like I'm living someone else's life." Jimmy was quiet for a moment, then replied, "It's all part of the agreement. I want you to have everything you need so things go as planned." "As planned?" she echoed, a hint of irony in her voice. "Do you always live like this? Planning every second of your life?" Jimmy looked at her, surprised by the question. He wasn't used to people challenging him. "Planning is what keeps everything running," he said firmly. "Without it, everything falls apart." Sarah smiled faintly, shaking her head. "I don't think everything can be controlled. Sometimes things just happen, whether you want them to or not." Her words unsettled him more than he expected. Abruptly, he stood and ended the conversation. "If you need anything, let Stephanie know," he said before walking back inside. A few days later, Jimmy decided to accompany Sarah to one of her medical appointments. He told himself he wanted to ensure everything was on track, but he couldn't deny a growing sense of responsibility for the situation. Sarah showed no surprise, but inwardly she was curious about his decision. At the doctor's office, they went through the usual examinations. Then, for the first time, they heard the baby's heartbeat. Sarah felt an unexpected wave of emotion. Her eyes welled with tears, though she tried to hide them. Jimmy, on the other hand, remained still, his expression unreadable. But something in his gaze had changed, as if the sound had touched something inside him that he wasn't ready to confront. "Everything looks perfect," the doctor said with a smile. "You can start thinking about what you want to do next, like prenatal care and the next steps." Sarah nodded, but Jimmy stayed silent. On the drive back to the mansion, the silence in the car was heavy. Jimmy appeared deep in thought, while Sarah struggled to find the right words to break the quiet. When they arrived, Jimmy opened the car door for her, a simple gesture that caught her off guard. "Thank you for today," Sarah said as she stepped out of the car. "It was the least I could do," Jimmy replied, not meeting her eyes. "I'll make sure everything continues to go well." Sarah observed as Jimmy walked into the mansion. His posture was as impeccable as always, yet something felt different. Perhaps hearing the heartbeat had stirred something inside him, or maybe it was just her imagination. Over the next few days, she noticed subtle changes. Jimmy began appearing more often in the house's shared spaces, and their brief conversations felt less mechanical. He asked how her appointments were going, how she was feeling, and even suggested ways for her to relax. One evening at the large dining table, he broke the usual silence. "Have you thought about what you'll do after all this is over?" he asked. Sarah was caught off guard. It was the first time he had shown interest in her future. "I don't have any plans," she admitted. "I still don't know what my life will look like after this." Jimmy nodded thoughtfully. "You'll have the means to start fresh wherever you choose. Just make sure you do something meaningful." Sarah looked at him curiously. Behind his usual calculated demeanor, she caught a glimpse of something genuine. It left her puzzled, but for the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone. One morning, she found a package outside her room, neatly wrapped with a handwritten note, "To help with your free time." Inside was a sketchbook and high-quality pencils. Sarah was stunned. She hadn't expected Jimmy to remember her offhand comment about drawing, much less act on it. Later, in the garden, Jimmy passed by and casually asked, "Did you like the gift?" She nodded. "Yes, thank you. I didn't expect it." He shrugged. "It seemed like something you'd enjoy." She smiled. "It is." Despite the comfortable routine, Sarah couldn't shake her lingering inner conflict. Days passed, but she felt disconnected, as if her presence in the mansion was only physical. Even as Jimmy remained his usual self, she sensed there was more to him than he allowed anyone to see. One morning, Jimmy surprised her by requesting a conversation after breakfast. This break in their usual dynamic made her uneasy. When they met in the sitting room, Jimmy sat beside a stack of papers. "I want to clarify a few points in the agreement," he began. Sarah's chest tightened. "I thought everything was already settled," she said cautiously. Jimmy regarded her for a moment. "It is. I just want to ensure you understand what happens after the birth. No surprises." Sarah exhaled slowly. "I understand. I leave and you move on." He gave a small nod. "Yes, but I want you to know that if you need help afterward, I'll be here. I don't want you to feel abandoned." Her eyebrows rose. This uncharacteristic offer took her by surprise. "That's unexpected coming from you," she remarked with a trace of sarcasm. He simply shrugged. "This prevents complications," he said plainly. Sarah chuckled softly but reconsidered her sarcasm. Perhaps he was trying to change even if he didn't quite know how. Later, Sarah decided to explore the mansion's countless rooms and hallways. Every turn revealed more extravagance than she could imagine. Eventually, she reached a small study at the end of a hallway. The door was slightly open, and she peeked inside. Jimmy was seated at a desk, holding a framed photograph. He wasn't working. He seemed deep in thought. It was the first time she had seen him appear vulnerable, lost in whatever memory that picture held. She knocked lightly on the door, and Jimmy quickly set the photograph down. "Sorry, I didn't mean to intrude," she said. Jimmy looked up, momentarily surprised. "It's fine," he replied, his expression once again composed. "Did you need something?" "No," she replied, hesitating. "I was just exploring. You seemed like you were deep in thought." Jimmy remained quiet for a moment before finally saying, "We all have things we'd rather not share." Sarah sensed he didn't want to continue on that topic, so she shifted the conversation. "This house is enormous. Do you always live here alone?" He nodded and crossed his arms. "It's more practical than it looks. I don't like distractions, and here I have the space I need." Sarah studied him, trying to understand how someone could be surrounded by such luxury, yet seem so isolated. "That must be strange," she said without thinking. "Having all this, but no one to share it with?" Jimmy averted his gaze, clearly uneasy. "I'm used to it. I don't need anyone for what I do." Sarah wanted to believe him, but his tone hinted otherwise. Before she could respond, Jimmy stood. "If you need anything, Stephanie can help," he said, cutting the conversation short. Later that evening, Sarah stepped onto the terrace. The night sky was clear, and the distant city lights sparkled. Sitting down, she let her thoughts drift. She couldn't stop thinking about the sound of the baby's heartbeat from her recent checkup. Something about it had left a deep impression on her. She tried to stay detached, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Hearing footsteps behind her, Sarah turned to see Jimmy. He looked as composed as always, though his eyes seemed tired. "You like this spot, don't you?" he asked. "I like the silence," she replied. "It helps me think." He walked over and stood beside her, gazing at the city lights. "Thinking isn't always helpful," he said. Sarah laughed quietly. "Tell that to someone who spends most of their time alone." Jimmy didn't reply immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. Being around others doesn't always help either. Sarah glanced at him, sensing a sadness in his words she hadn't noticed before. "Maybe you need something you can't control, Jimmy," she said, her words slipping out unfiltered. She didn't regret it. Jimmy frowned slightly, as if considering a response, but chose not to say anything. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. In the weeks that followed, Sarah found it harder to maintain the emotional barrier she'd built around herself. Jimmy remained distant, yet there were fleeting moments when glimpses of his true self emerged. Despite her efforts to stay detached, she found herself wanting to understand the man who had brought her into this strange, new life. At the same time, Jimmy struggled with unfamiliar emotions. What he had expected to be a simple arrangement had turned into something more complicated. Sarah wasn't just part of a plan anymore, and that realization unsettled him. A week later, another checkup was scheduled. Sarah woke up early, a mix of anxiety and curiosity coursing through her. The months seemed to be flying by, and the thought of seeing the baby for the first time, even just on a screen, made her heart race. She wondered if Jimmy would join her at the appointment like he had before. When she arrived at breakfast, she saw Stephanie and Jimmy discussing the day's schedule. "Ready?" Jimmy asked, glancing up from his folder of documents. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, doing her best to sound calm. "Good. We'll go together," he said, leaving no room for debate. As they headed to the car, the silence between them felt heavier than usual. Jimmy seemed as composed as always, yet something about his demeanor had changed. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if he was feeling as nervous as she was, though she knew he'd never admit it. At the doctor's office, the physician greeted them warmly and prepared the ultrasound equipment. "Today, we'll get a clear view of the baby," the doctor explained. Sarah lay down, trying to ignore the cold gel on her abdomen as the doctor began the procedure. Jimmy stood nearby, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the screen. Then they heard it, the steady, strong rhythm of a heartbeat. And then another. "Well, here's a surprise," the doctor said, smiling. "You're having twins." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. "Twins?" she asked, barely above a whisper. She had never considered the possibility. A wave of emotions swept over her. Surprise, joy, and something she couldn't quite name. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly as she tried to process the news. Jimmy remained quiet for a moment. His usual serious expression softened, and for the first time, Sarah saw something different in him. Genuine awe. He leaned forward slightly, keeping his eyes on the monitor. "Two?" he asked, seeking confirmation. "Two?" the doctor affirmed with a reassuring smile. "Both are healthy and developing well." The only sound in the room was the rhythmic heartbeat echoing from the screen. For Sarah, it was a moment she couldn't ignore. Despite her efforts to stay detached, she felt a profound connection to the two lives growing within her. Beside her, Jimmy remained silent, though his expression betrayed something deeper. For the first time, his typically guarded demeanor softened. He looked vulnerable, perhaps even overwhelmed by the prospect of becoming a father. On the drive back to the mansion, the quiet between them carried more weight than usual. It wasn't the usual distant silence, it was thick with unspoken emotions. Sarah finally spoke. "You don't seem like the type to be easily caught off guard," she said, attempting to break the tension. Jimmy kept his eyes on the road. "I'm not," he replied after a pause. "But this is different." Intrigued, Sarah glanced over at him. It was rare to see Jimmy anything less than composed. "Is it frightening?" she asked softly. He turned to her briefly before answering. Number. It's astonishing. Knowing that in a few months, 2 entirely new lives will depend on me. Sarah felt a pang in her chest. She knew she would eventually have to part with the babies, but hearing Jimmy speak of them with such care made her realize how much she was already attached. They depend on me too, at least for now, she said, her voice steady despite the ache. Jimmy nodded. I know, and that's why I want to ensure you're well. Not just physically, but in every way. That matters to me. Sarah absorbed his words, struck by the sincerity in his tone. It was the first time Jimmy had spoken so openly about the reality they were both navigating. That evening, Sarah stood on the terrace, gazing at the distant horizon. Jimmy joined her once again, his hesitation clear in his usually confident posture. I can't stop thinking about what the doctor said today, he began, sitting beside her. 2 babies, 2 lives. Sarah looked at him, surprised by his candor. It's a lot of responsibility, she said. It's more than that, he replied, his eyes fixed on the view. This is the first time I've faced something that can't be calculated. I can't predict who they'll become. I can't control how they'll turn out. Sarah shivered slightly at his admission. It was rare for Jimmy to acknowledge something beyond his control. She could sense that, like her, he was slowly changing. Sometimes, she said, not knowing can be good. It can bring things you never imagined. He turned to her, seeming to consider her words more seriously than she expected. For the first time, he appeared willing to accept that not everything could be planned. As the days passed, the news of the twins brought a subtle but meaningful shift in the mansion. Stephanie began modifying the nursery, preparing it for 2 babies instead of 1. Sarah watched the changes with mixed feelings, knowing that, according to the agreement, she would eventually have to let them go. Yet, she couldn't ignore how deeply connected she felt to the lives growing inside her. Meanwhile, Jimmy began showing small but unexpected gestures of kindness. After one of Sarah's medical appointments, he personally escorted her to the car, a task he typically left to his assistant or staff. Are you all right? He asked, holding the door open. Surprised by the gesture, Sarah nodded. Yes, thank you. On the way back, he broke their usual silence. Is there anything you need? Anything that might make you more comfortable? Sarah turned toward him, trying to read his expression. It didn't feel like an empty question. There was a genuineness to his offer, though she wasn't sure how to respond. Nothing comes to mind, she said carefully, but thank you for asking. Jimmy nodded, his attention returning to the road, leaving Sarah to wonder about the subtle changes she was beginning to see in him. Sarah had a sense that something had shifted. Even though she still felt unsure about Jimmy, it was clear that he was starting to show genuine concern for her. Back at the mansion, small changes became noticeable. One day, she found fresh pillows and blankets in her room, with a short note attached, "To help you rest better." The gesture made her smile. It was a small but meaningful act. Later, while sipping tea in the living room, Jimmy quietly joined her. He seemed more at ease than usual, though still carried his usual serious demeanor. Did you like what I left in your room? He asked plainly. Yes, I did. It was thoughtful of you, she replied, watching him carefully. Good. I want to make sure you're comfortable. That's important to me, he said, holding her gaze. Sarah frowned slightly. While she appreciated the gesture, she couldn't quite get past the barrier of mistrust. You're changing, Jimmy, she said bluntly, or at least it seems that way, but I still don't know why. Jimmy paused, then let out a sigh. Maybe you're right. Maybe I am changing. But the truth is, I don't know how to be different. I'm not used to caring. His words seemed to surprise him as much as they did her. Seeing Jimmy admit something so personal was unexpected. That night, as Sarah sat on the terrace staring at the sky, she reflected on their conversation. Jimmy wasn't what she had imagined. He was difficult to read, but there was a side of him that felt human, though she wasn't sure whether that was good or bad. Meanwhile, Jimmy was in his office, looking at the contract that had set all of this in motion. For the first time, he felt the weight of what it represented. When he started this arrangement, he'd had one clear goal: to have an heir and move on. But now, things were more complicated. He could tell he was beginning to care, and that unsettled him. The next morning, Jimmy surprised Sarah by joining her for breakfast. "There's something I'd like to discuss," he said, cutting straight to the point. Sarah looked at him curious. "What is it?" He hesitated, then began, "I know you still don't trust me, and I can't blame you. I've never been good at trusting people, and that's turned me into someone who maybe isn't easy to deal with." Sarah stayed quiet, letting him continue. "I've had experiences that taught me not to depend on anyone, to not let anyone get close enough to hurt me. But with you, with what we're building, I realize that maybe I'm wrong." Sarah blinked, surprised by his honesty. It wasn't like Jimmy to talk about himself this way. "We all have our barriers, Jimmy," she said gently, "but that doesn't mean we need to hide behind them forever." Jimmy nodded, considering her words. "Maybe you're right, but changing isn't easy for me." Sarah gave a small smile. "No one said it would be." Later that day, Jimmy joined her for a walk in the garden. They began by talking about small, inconsequential things, but the conversation soon turned to the babies. "Have you thought about names?" he asked, catching her off guard. "No, not yet. I thought that was something you'd want to decide on your own," she replied. "I think it would be fair to do it together," he said. Sarah was taken aback. It was becoming clear that Jimmy was making an effort to be more open and present. While she still approached him cautiously, she couldn't deny that he was trying. As the sun set, they sat quietly on a bench, watching the colors fade from the sky. "I never imagined I'd be here, doing something like this," Sarah said softly. "Neither did I," Jimmy admitted with a slight smile, "but maybe this is exactly where we need to be." Sarah looked at him closely. For the first time, he seemed to be letting his guard down. She began to wonder if this arrangement was becoming more than just a contract, if it might be the start of something much larger. The next morning began like any other. Sarah felt the strain of her pregnancy with each movement, but she pushed herself to stick to her routine. Jimmy, as usual, was engrossed in his work. Their interactions had grown more frequent, creating a quiet sense of comfort between them. But as the day went on, something changed. Just before lunchtime, Sarah felt an unusual pain. At first, she tried to dismiss it as another pregnancy ache, but the discomfort quickly intensified. Alarmed, she called for Stephanie, who instantly understood the seriousness of the situation. "Jimmy needs to know about this," Stephanie said, helping Sarah to sit down. "This could be the start of labor." Sarah nodded, trying to stay calm as the pain increased. Stephanie rushed off to get Jimmy, who arrived moments later. For the first time, his typically impassive face showed real concern. "Sarah, what's happening?" he asked urgently, coming to her side. "I think it's happening," she said, her voice strained. "The babies are coming." Jimmy froze for a moment, as though trying to process what was happening. But he quickly regained his composure and prepared to act. He picked up the phone, instructed the driver to prepare the car, and told Stephanie to gather everything needed for the hospital. "We're leaving now," he said firmly, his voice tinged with urgency Sarah had never heard before. The drive to the hospital was a whirlwind of emotions. Sarah focused on managing her pain, while Jimmy, seated beside her, watched her with a mixture of worry and determination. He instinctively held her hand throughout the journey, a simple gesture that held deeper meaning. "We're almost there," he murmured, squeezing her hand gently. "You'll be okay. We'll be okay." Sarah remained silent, but his words brought her a strange sense of calm. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. The medical team, prearranged by Jimmy's thorough planning, whisked Sarah into the delivery room. Jimmy refused to leave her side, even when staff suggested he wait outside. "I'm staying," he stated firmly, holding Sarah's hand. "I'm not going anywhere." The hours that followed were intense and surreal. Jimmy saw a strength in Sarah that he hadn't expected as she delivered the twins. Time seemed to stretch, each moment heavy with anticipation and emotion. Finally, the first cry pierced the air, a sound so small yet so powerful. "A boy," the doctor announced with a smile. "A beautiful, healthy boy." Jimmy's heart raced as he watched the newborn placed carefully on a nearby table. Before he could fully process what was happening, a second cry broke through the room. "A girl," the doctor said. "Your daughter." Sarah, exhausted but her eyes bright, gazed at the two babies as they were cleaned and wrapped. She longed to hold them, even knowing it would be brief. Jimmy stood frozen, overwhelmed by what he was witnessing. Then, something seemed to shift within him. He moved closer to Sarah, took her hand, and said quietly, "You were incredible. Thank you." Silent tears fell down Sarah's face. She wasn't sure if they were from relief, joy, or a growing ache she couldn't ignore. When the babies were placed in Sarah's arms, she held them with immense care. Their tiny fingers twitched involuntarily as she studied every detail of their faces and hands. The love she felt was overpowering, and she knew she could never completely let them go. Beside her, Jimmy remained quiet, but his expression softened in a way she had never seen. When he finally held his son, something shifted in him. He felt a connection far deeper than the idea of an heir, a profound, undeniable bond. Holding his daughter, he closed his eyes for a moment as if to etch the experience into his memory. When he opened them, he looked at Sarah, and for the first time, she saw genuine gratitude in his eyes. "They're perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah nodded, tears falling freely now, but she didn't try to stop them. That night, as Sarah rested in her room, Jimmy remained in the observation area, watching the twins sleep. A flood of emotions swept over him, emotions he had never allowed himself to feel before. For the first time, he understood that these children weren't merely part of a plan or a legacy. They were something far greater, his first encounter with true, unconditional love. Stephanie arrived with coffee, setting the cup on a nearby table. "Mr. Lewis, is everything all right?" she asked gently. Jimmy looked at her, clearly struggling to find the right words. For the first time in a long while, he replied, "I think it is." Stephanie smiled and left him alone with his thoughts and his children. Meanwhile, Sarah awoke in her room, overcome with loneliness. The joy of the twins' arrival was overshadowed by the contract that still defined their situation. The babies, now the center of her world, would not remain hers for long. But her feelings shifted when Jimmy walked in, holding both babies. He looked different, as if the moment had reshaped not only his relationship with the babies, but also with her. Sitting beside her on the bed, he handed her the boy while holding the girl. "I don't know how," he admitted, gazing at the twins, "but this has changed everything." Sarah nodded, recognizing that no matter how challenging the road ahead, this moment was a miracle she would carry with her forever. Sarah was fully aware of what the day meant. Since the twins' birth, she'd been living in a mix of joy and pain. She loved them more deeply than she thought possible, but the contract's terms were clear. Her time at the mansion was coming to an end. She packed her few belongings into a small suitcase and glanced at the cribs, where the babies still slept peacefully. Though her eyes brimmed with tears, she refused to cry. She didn't want her final memories here to be tainted by weakness. She tried to convince herself that she had known what she was signing, that this was the right decision. Stephanie knocked on her door softly, stepping in with a concerned expression. "Is everything ready?" she asked quietly. Sarah nodded and swallowed her emotions. "Yes, thank you for everything." Stephanie hesitated, then asked, "Are you sure this is what you want? It seems like there's something more between you and Mr. Lewis." Sarah forced a smile, though her chest felt heavy. "It's not about what I want. It's about what we agreed upon." Stephanie didn't push further and simply promised to let Jimmy know Sarah was ready to leave. When Sarah descended the stairs, suitcase in hand, she found Jimmy standing in the foyer, his gaze fixed on her. The cold, calculating man she had once met seemed to be gone. The Jimmy before her now looked vulnerable, as if he were about to lose something precious. "Everything's ready," she said, breaking the silence. He didn't respond immediately, stepping toward her with an intense expression. "Are you really leaving?" he asked, his voice low and rough. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat and stood firm. "That was the deal. I've done my part. It's time to move on." Jimmy paused, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the contract. He held it as if it no longer held any significance. "This contract," he began, his voice now steady, "should never have defined what's happening between us." Before Sarah could respond, he tore the paper into pieces and let them fall to the floor. The sound echoed through the foyer, heavy with meaning. "I don't want you to go, Sarah. I don't want this to end here." Sarah froze, her eyes fixed on the scattered pieces. Her heart raced, but fear and pain kept her hesitant. "Jimmy, you can't just tear up a contract and expect that to change everything. It's not that simple." He stepped closer, his face filled with emotion. "I know it's not simple. None of this has been simple for me. But these past months have shown me something I never admitted before. I need you, Sarah. Not just because of the twins, but because you've brought something into my life I didn't even know I was missing." His words struck her deeply, but she shook her head, still resisting. "How do I know this is real?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How can I trust that you won't change your mind or pull away when things get tough?" Jimmy took a deep breath, visibly struggling. "Because I've already tried living without feeling anything for anyone, and it left me empty. You've shown me that I don't need to be afraid to connect, to be human. And yes, it scares me, but I don't want to lose this. Lose you." Tears streamed down Sarah's face, and she couldn't stop them. "I fell in love with you, Jimmy," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But you don't understand how hard it is to trust someone again. I've spent my whole life being discarded, ignored. How can I believe you won't do the same?" Jimmy moved closer, so near that she could feel his breath. "Because you changed everything for me, and I don't take that lightly. I don't know how to prove it to you, Sarah, but I'll try every day for the rest of my life if you let me." His words finally broke through her defenses. Sarah felt something shift inside. There were risks, she knew that, but for the first time, she wondered if they were worth facing. "What if it doesn't work out?" she whispered. Jimmy took her hands and looked directly into her eyes. "Then we'll try again and again if necessary. I won't give up on you, Sarah. Never." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Sarah's doubts faded, replaced by something stronger, hope. She met Jimmy's gaze, and saw that he was truly letting go of his control and his barriers to be with her. Finally, she nodded, letting the tears fall freely. "Okay, I'll stay." Jimmy sighed in relief and pulled her into a firm embrace. For the first time, Sarah felt like this was where she was meant to be. As morning light filtered into Jimmy's mansion, Sarah woke to the soft sounds of the twins in the nursery next door. Everything felt different. For the first time in a long while, there was no weight of uncertainty, no tension from a binding agreement. She had chosen to stay. And more importantly, Jimmy had chosen to open his heart, allowing them to build something together. Sarah got up and walked to the nursery. Sarah saw the twins were awake, cooing softly in their cribs. She leaned down, gently touching their cheeks and murmuring soft words. Before she could become lost in the moment, she heard footsteps behind her. It was Jimmy. He stood in the doorway, watching with a faint smile. His usually distant and controlled eyes now seemed softer, showing a warmth Sarah could only describe as love. "Good morning," he said, stepping inside and approaching the babies. "Good morning," Sarah replied. As Jimmy lifted the baby boy into his arms, a spark lit his expression. "I never imagined this moment would feel so natural," he admitted, almost to himself. Sarah smiled, seeing him embrace his role as a father. It was deeply moving to watch him grow closer to the twins. Over the next few weeks, they adjusted to the new family dynamic. Though inexperienced, Jimmy tried to learn. He changed diapers, albeit clumsily at first, prepared bottles, and even sang lullabies. His gruff voice might not have been melodic, but his commitment to the twins proved he was changing. One evening, as they sat on the couch with the twins sleeping nearby, Jimmy turned to Sarah. "I've been thinking about something," he said, his tone calm but serious. "What is it?" she asked, intrigued. He took a deep breath before continuing. "I want us to be a real family, not just because of the twins, but because I want you by my side forever." Sarah sat in silence, taken aback by the depth of his words. She knew their connection had grown stronger, but she hadn't expected this. "Jimmy, that's a big step," she replied carefully. "Are you sure?" Jimmy took her hands and looked directly into her eyes. "I've never been more sure of anything. I know I made mistakes at the start, but I want to build something with you. Something based not on contracts or obligations, but on love." His sincerity was undeniable. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she nodded. "I want that too, Jimmy. Let's try." A few weeks later, they held a small ceremony in the mansion's garden, inviting only close staff members, including Stephanie, who had been part of their journey. The day was perfect. The sun was shining, and a light breeze rustled the flowers. Sarah wore a simple but elegant dress, and Jimmy looked sharp in a tailored suit. Stephanie held the twins, who were dressed in adorable outfits, and couldn't hide her tears of joy. When Jimmy and Sarah exchanged vows, they spoke from the heart. Jimmy promised to always be the man she deserved, and to stand by her side no matter what. Sarah vowed to trust him and support him in becoming his best self. After the ceremony, they embraced each other and the twins, and Stephanie said, "You make a beautiful family." She was right. For the first time, Jimmy, Sarah, and the babies were exactly where they belonged. Life continued, filled with challenges and joy. Jimmy and Sarah worked together to create a warm, loving home for the twins, facing sleepless nights and constant demands with a mix of exhaustion and happiness. One night, as Sarah put the babies to bed, Jimmy entered the room and silently wrapped her in a tight embrace. She rested her head against his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said softly. "Thank you for showing me I could trust again," she replied. Months later, on a sunny afternoon, they sat in the garden watching the twins play on a soft mat. The children's laughter filled the air. Sarah turned to Jimmy, who sat beside her, and saw him smiling. "Are you happy?" she asked. Jimmy looked at her and then at the twins before replying. "I never thought I could be this happy," he said. "You've given me more than I ever knew I needed, Sarah. A family, a purpose, love." Sarah smiled back, feeling a peace she hadn't felt in years. "And you've shown me that love can grow even through struggles. Thank you for that." As they leaned in for a gentle kiss, the twins babbled something that sounded like "Mama" and "Dada." Both Jimmy and Sarah laughed, filled with emotion, and gathered the twins close. In that moment, they knew they had found something real. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was rich with love, understanding, and hope, and that was all they needed. If this story touched your heart or inspired you in any way, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share how it made you feel. What did you think of Jimmy's actions? Share your thoughts in the comments. How would you rate this story? From 0 to 10, don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another moving story. By subscribing and turning on notifications, you'll be the first to know when we have a new tale to share. Thank you for being a part of our journey, as your support means everything to us. Together, let's keep spreading stories that inspire.